Everyone come on in. Do we need some more seats? Everyone got lunch? Thank you so much for being with us today, everyone. I can't believe your first day of school, you get pizza from the pie and Senator Mitt Romney.
I know the priority of that.
Well, they're all ready for you now. We're so grateful that you are here with us today for what is going to be an outstanding conversation from our senator with Rick Larsen. We are grateful for our relationship with the Sutherland Institute that is helping to bring this here to us today. This is a great conversation. We're looking forward to this, Senator. We're so glad you are here with us today, and for the students, one of these rare and great opportunities for you to be with us today. After we hear from the senator today, we will have a panel discussion here in this room. So we encourage you to stay, listen. We'll talk about some of the things we went through today with the senator. It's going to be time well spent on very critical issues that we care about. So thank you for being with us, and we'll turn the time over to you, Rick.
Thank you very much. Thank you, Senator. Rick, climb on top of our perches.
All right. Okay, thank you. Thank you.
I can't believe it's been a year since we did this last.
That's true.
Time goes by, a lot has happened. So the audience knows the focus of our conversation today is going to be mostly about America's economic challenges and opportunities. There appear to be plenty of both. So should we dive right in?
You bet.
Okay, good. There's one issue I want to address because I'm asked about this all the time. So the supply chain in our nation, there's no apparent reason it should have changed significantly. It's always been raw materials or product, goes for refinement or manufacturing, and then it's delivered for retail sales. Some complexities along the way, but it feels different since COVID. It's never fully re-engaged. Can you explain to people why?
Yeah, and I'm going to put it in a broader context, which is that as the world has adopted free enterprise, and following the collapse of the Soviet Union, there was a recognition, free enterprise works. China adopted it to a degree. Other nations have. Russia has adopted free enterprise of one sort or another. We anticipated that everybody would play by the same rules, so that companies would get various raw materials from various places. We'd supply things from different countries, and we all went to the places where we could get the best quality for the lowest price for the products we had. But China decided to play a different game, which is they decided to play by entirely different rules, which began by saying, we're going to dominate the raw materials that are needed to make those things which are going to be the industries of the future. So we're going to dominate the raw ingredients for batteries, for solar panels, and the like, and semiconductors and so forth. And so they went around the world with the so-called Belt and Road investment, about $1 trillion. They invested in infrastructure, not in China, but outside of China. And if you look at where they were investing, we sort of said initially, oh, they're helping the African nations and the Latin American nations. Oh, no. They were buying mines around the world, and then they were getting railroads to take the product of those mines to a port. Then they were buying the port to make sure they had the control of the raw material to the port and then to China. Oh, I forgot processing. Many times the raw materials require processing, and they bought processors as well. So if you look at the key raw materials that are needed for batteries and solar panels, for instance, in the world today, they're basically 70 to 80% owned at the mine by China, or 70 or 80% owned at the processing center by China. They dominate. So as the world goes electric, as we have more and more electric cars and other elements of our society that are driven by electricity, China becomes the new OPEC. And we've gotten used to OPEC, a bunch of nations that came together and they collude on pricing. But the old OPEC had a lot of members in it. Now, Saudi Arabia may have been the biggest and strongest, but there were a lot of members in OPEC. The new OPEC, the electric OPEC, has only one nation, China. And so as we electrify our fleet of automobiles, recognize we are completely beholden to and subject to China. So part of what's happened is we've allowed ourselves to find that we're in a position of extreme weakness and vulnerability to a nation that's may have some hostile intent. So that's one part of the supply chain challenge that we have. China has been playing industrial policy as the nation, buying key resources and locking up and creating monopolies. That's illegal here. Our country doesn't do it, and we don't create monopolies, we break them up. And we've let this go on and on and on. And so that's a real challenge. Another challenge that we had is semiconductors. We used to make the best semiconductors in the world here in the United States. And American companies like Intel that were making semiconductors said, oh, some of these other semiconductors, the real hard ones to make, we're not making a lot of money on them. We'll let them get made in Taiwan. And so TSMC, the largest semiconductor company in the world, is in Taiwan. They produce about 70% of the semiconductors in the world. Virtually everything you buy, cars, cell phones, iPads, TVs, and so forth, require semiconductors. I'm told a Ford pickup has 50 different semiconductors in it. 70% of them come from Taiwan, all right? And so we're now extremely vulnerable there. What happened following COVID, the COVID pandemic, was that the demand for semiconductors dropped during COVID, and so they pulled back their production at TSMC. Then when the demand came roaring back, they were unable to keep up, and we've had a hard time getting the raw materials that we need. So we're getting back. I would note that Taiwan is about 100 miles from China. As part of our national policy, we consider it one China, Taiwan plus the People's Republic of China. China may try and grab Taiwan, or at least take it over, perhaps in a nonviolent manner. But think about what it would mean if all the semiconductors we need for our rockets, our airplanes, our automobiles, our trucks, and so forth, all come from an entity controlled by China. So yeah, supply chain is a big issue, and that's why this year a number of senators and myself drafted a piece of legislation calling the Department of Defense to rethink all of our supply chain and to make sure that we are able to supply all the raw materials we need to defend ourselves from free countries. Doesn't have to be just from the United States, but from free countries. And by the way, sorry to go off like this. No. One last thing. One thing that really irritates me, when you hear, when the president, and it's basically the presidents on the opposition party, President Obama and now President Biden, when they name huge swaths of land in America as national monuments, the enviros are all very excited. That's fantastic, you're preserving this land. Well, that's the land where we have uranium and where we have the raw materials that go into making batteries. So we're basically, by doing that, guaranteeing that America can't be competitive in the new economy. So these are some of the reasons why a few of us are a little upset by the land grab taken by the federal government.
So you mentioned the National Defense Act. Let's drill down on that, because within your answer, your answer went from economic concerns to national security concerns seamlessly. Tell us a little bit more about that Defense Act and what you advocated for within it.
Well, Senator Menendez, who's the Democrat chairman of the Foreign Relations Committee, he and I drafted a bill saying, you're going to find this hard to believe, saying that we ought to have a strategy for dealing with China. Hard to believe because you'd think we already had one, but we don't. China has a game plan by 2049 to dominate the world, economically, militarily, geopolitically. And by the way, they're on a pathway to get there. They've got some real challenges right now, but they're on a pathway to get there. It was pointed out in Graham Allison's book that when China is able to have the same output per worker we have more output per person because we're automated. And in agriculture, we use tractors and technology. They're developing those technologies and becoming more automated. But when they have the same output per person we have, their economy will be 4 times larger than ours. And if their economy is 4 times larger than ours, their military will be at least 4 times larger than ours. So we recognize there's some real challenges as we look at a growing, thriving China. And we will be able to continue to lead the world if we're smart and have a strategy. So part of the legislation we put in place is to call on America to finally develop a strategy. And that doesn't have to be made public, but it does have to be something which Republican and Democrat administrations buy into and continue to execute. Part of that is economic, which is you can't allow China to play by rules that the rest of us can't play by, to monopolize key raw materials, for instance, and then have access to our markets. You can't allow that to happen, or else they will have such resources that we can't keep up.
You raise a lot of interesting questions, and news about China always causes an interesting dual response in the media and among people we talk to in the state of Utah. What do you consider some of the more notable challenges? Well, first of all, do you believe we have a coherent foreign policy when it comes to China? And what have we done to harm that? And that could be anything from balloons flying overhead to the theft of intellectual property. How are we managing the policy that does exist?
Well, we've been sort of ad hoc. We respond to things China does and say, hey, you can't do that anymore, and we're going to shoot down your balloon. And not that I disagree with the steps we've taken, they're just not comprehensive and coherent. A strategy, when you hear the word strategy, I mean, I made my living before politics in developing strategies for companies. Companies first I consulted to, and then companies I bought. And a strategy was, what are your objectives? What are the principles that you're going to apply? What are all the tactics that are going to allow you to get there? So for instance, we had to have for each country in the world a plan for how we're going to make sure that we're strong there, we're getting our voice heard there, and that any attacks that are coming from China or investments coming from China, we're able to counter and make sure that we preserve our interest there. We had to have that for each country. We ought to decide exactly what it is we want to communicate to the world. We need to understand which products we're going to allow them to sell into our country. We're going to have to decide which semiconductor chips we're going to allow them to buy. By the way, the only way we can control AI from getting in the hands of very bad people is limiting the massive chips that are required to run AI. So these are the kinds of things, just some of the tactics we're going to have if we're ultimately going to be smart in dealing with China. And so I don't criticize either the former Republican administration or the current Democrat administration for the tactical steps they've taken along the way, but say we need to have some way of putting it all together and knowing what we're going to do. And with regards to the old Soviet Union, our strategy there was containment. All right, we were going to do everything in our power to contain them from going to other parts of the world, whether it's Africa or Latin America. We're going to every corner. We're going to make sure and contain them in one place because we felt that economically they couldn't keep up if we contained them to where they were, and that ended up being right. By the way, one of the great accomplishments, there are very few, of my and your generation, is that we allowed two great powers to exist and not go to war. In the history of the earth, there have been 15 instances where a new nation has become a superpower to confront an old superpower. In those 15 cases, in 12, it resulted in war. Only 3 escaped war. One of those 3 was the US versus the Soviet Union, where we did not go to war. And that, great tribute to those. I'm hopeful that we're likewise going to be able to thread the same needle with regards to China. I can't imagine going to war with the kinds of weapons we have, not just atomic, but hazardous pathogens, cyber warfare, other kinds of warfare that exist today. We can't possibly imagine going to war. But it's going to take a real effort, and we're going to have to get a lot smarter in the way we respond and confront China to help both of us divert our courses sufficiently that we can compete and succeed for our people, but not cause conflict.
I'm somewhat compelled to ask the next question, and a little bit of a preface for the audience and those who may not be familiar with Sutherland Institute. We're a public policy think tank. We are not a political organization. And so I ask this question from a public policy standpoint. Do you feel that this current administration, is the relationship with China unduly compromised because of the current administration?
Well, I don't know that I would blame any one administration over another, but I can tell you that we don't have much of a relationship with China at this stage, at the senior level. There's an attempt on the part of the President and the Secretary of State to establish some links. The Secretary of the Treasury was over there. Secretary Austin of the Department of Defense has not been able to have a dialogue yet with his counterpart in the PRC. So we're behind there. Some of that is just anger at what we're doing with regards to limiting the semiconductors we'll send to China, and I understand why they don't like that. Some of it is anger at the tariffs that President Trump put in place, and President Biden didn't get rid of them They're there and will probably get even more onerous as time goes on, in part because we're not going to allow someone to monopolize a product which has normally been in global commerce and then charge a monopoly price on it to us, and then undercut the competitiveness of American industries. So China's not going to like it, but I think we have to show backbone and strength. At the same time, I do hope that we're able to see a great deal more dialogue. I would not go so far as to have a president say, "I love you, Xi Jinping." I wouldn't go that far, but I would think efforts to have more communication and to find places of common interest. We have a lot of places of common interest. One of them is on the climate change. And I know my side of the aisle doesn't want to talk about climate change. Why, I don't know. But climate change is a global issue. China is by far the largest emitter of CO2 in the world and will continue to grow in their emissions of CO2. Our emissions of CO2 are going down. We ought to be able to find some collaboration. By the way, they make the point, yeah, but on a per capita basis, you guys are putting out a lot more CO2 than we are. They're right on that. All right, so we can each point at each other, but there's a common interest that I think we can find.
Slight current headline diversion, because I'm always interested in comments about depoliticizing certain issues. So we're watching an unspeakable disaster in Hawaii. We're watching the political attacks begin to emerge, and we're starting to see accusations that we'll see if they play out or not. Are we making a mistake? And you can say this to a room full of young minds who have the future in their hands. Do we make a mistake in politicizing everything?
Oh, absolutely. It's really sad. Look, what's happened in Washington, and there are some that Ian Bremmer, for instance, who's an observer of foreign policy and provides advice to corporations around the world, looks at America and says the problem with America is that you become politically dysfunctional. You can't work anymore. It's not working, and in part that's because some people go to Washington to make noise, and some go to make law. And those that just go to make noise are getting to be a larger group, and they want to appeal to the base of their respective party, and to get them excited, to have them all yelling and angry. It's on both sides of the aisle. And so if you're elected as a senator or a congressperson, you go back and you just want to make noise, there's a big crowd that loves to hear the noise. If you ask them, by the way, what did you pass? What legislation did you write or negotiate that became law? They got nothing to say. Because to become law in the United States, for something to become law, requires both parties to support it. I mean, I hope you understand that. For something to pass the United States Senate requires 60 votes. Neither party has 60. So you have to get Democrats and Republicans to agree. Oh, and by the way, we have a Republican House and a Democrat president and a Democrat Senate. So for something to become law requires reaching common ground. But the base of each party isn't interested in compromise or reaching common ground. If you go out and tell people, I'm going to fight for common ground in this important issue, well, they'll boo you. They want you to say, I'm going to attack. These guys are bad. It's the interest in American politics today is to be angry and attacking, making noise. And at a time when we face extraordinary challenges, AI, climate change, China, and our debt, not to mention our social capital as a society. As we face these extraordinary challenges, to have our political system locked in making noise is a little frustrating.
It's interesting. It's actually locked up by design, which I think some people in their frustration fail to realize because of that need for compromise.
Yeah.
Let's talk about AI. So there are at least two dimensions to AI that can make some people nervous, along with all the wonderful potential. And in fact, more functionality right now than I think a lot of people realize. It's already having a tremendous effect. But people worry, A, am I going to lose my job? And what are the ethical considerations around AI? It's a technology that has the potential, even though it can do certain things, should we allow it to do certain things?
We have no choice.
Give us a flyby. How are you looking at it?
Well, I mean, Meta's most recent version of AI, Llama, is available on open source. So we can regulate all we want to, but it's available to anybody in the world. not just American, any entity in the world that wants to get AI can get it by getting Llama on open source. So it's out there. There will be new versions that will be far more powerful than the current version, but they're coming, I mean, like every 6 months. I mean, I'm one of those that's, I mean, I'm terrified of it. I got to be honest with you. People say, well, you need to regulate it. It's like, what, a bunch of 70-year-olds in the Senate are going to regulate it? You know, I can barely operate my cell phone. I mean, how am I going to regulate AI? And I can regulate it. Maybe I can regulate companies here, but it's global. This is a technology, so it's going to be around the world. Probably I mean, we do spend, by the way, in the Senate, and I know in the House as well, a lot of time working with the leaders of some of the AI companies to say, how can we prevent the worst from happening? And they say, well, you can engage efforts at AI to prevent the worst from happening. That's one thing you can do. Number two, you can try and manage where these massive chips are that are required to run AI and try and keep them from getting in the hands of the world's worst people. I mean, you know, right now there are probably 100 scientists in the world that can create a smallpox pathogen, but they're all associated with government labs. But if AI just goes and runs amok and is anywhere, well, you're going to have 1 million people that can make a smallpox pathogen, and some of them won't be good people. I mean, these are. I mean, so I'm very concerned about AI. I don't see how we're able to regulate AI to keep it from happening. I think it happens, and it'll happen around the world. And the best thing we can do, in my opinion, there are a few things we can do. One is to manage very carefully the semiconductor chips. Number two is when a company is about to come out with a new major leap forward in an AI product, to test it first. And to have people, not just in government, but in industry, test it before we launch it into the world to make sure that it doesn't, for instance, allow people to take over all of our bank accounts or to shut down all of our infrastructure or to do other things that would be devastating to our society.
So in your private career, you've dealt with a lot of real-life people and real-life companies very successfully. You understand the value of human capital, of mind share, of intellectual property. How does a young person prepare themselves in an emerging AI economy and knowing that it's a bus that possibly can't be driven, certainly from a regulatory standpoint? Where is the value of human beings?
I wish I had the right answer for all you guys on that. The truth is, there are some jobs that AI will never have any impact on, all right? If you're a nurse or you're a surgeon, you know, AI is not going to replace you. You're working in government, you'll never get rid of government employees. So they're always, all right. So
going to government.
Yeah. So I mean, there are a lot of places throughout our economy where you know, you're a contractor. I mean, you know, you're building homes, you're building apartments. AI is not going to lay bricks, all right, or be a plumber or electrician. And these are high value enterprises and careers. So there are plenty of places where AI won't affect you. There are other places where AI will have a big impact, and the key is to learn how to use it to make yourself more productive. AI is a tool, just like a computer is a tool, and the internet is a tool. It gives us more information, helps us make better decisions. And if you're going into a profession, let's say in finance or the law or radiology, you know, as a physician, then you want to become conversant with how AI can help you and make you more effective. And those people that are good at AI will do very, very well indeed. But you know, don't be one of those that says, I'm going to take a lot of phys ed and then hope I get a job in finance. That's not going to work. You're going to need to be conversant not just in financial matters, but also in how AI can make you more productive.
For those who watch from a distance, observe Congress, consider voting, sometimes do, sometimes don't. Is there any reassurance you can give people as a member of Congress? Is there anything more positive that happens when the cameras are off as opposed to what we see on the evening news?
Yeah, the good news is that the people, particularly in the Senate, I don't know about the House. I mean, it's like we're worlds apart. We have very little interaction between the House of Representatives and the United States Senate. One, there are so many of them, it's like I don't know how they even know each other's names, all right? So, but there are only 100 of us in the Senate, and we know each other. and we get along pretty well. My friend, Kem Gardner, whose name is on the outside of this building, he and his family came to visit Washington, and I put them up in the Senate gallery to just watch us voting at some point. And after the week that he spent in Washington and his family spent in Washington was over, I said, "Hey, what was the most impressive thing?" He said, "We watched Cory Booker and who was it? Ted Cruz down having a conversation, laughing and yucking it up. It's like, we couldn't believe that." And it's like, yeah, we all get along. So the best thing I can tell you is that there is collegiality amongst our group, and among the senators, because we recognize you have to have someone from the Republican Party and Democrat Party come together for something to become law. Those ones of us who want to create law are looking for someone across the aisle to do a deal with. And so I have a bill, for instance, called the Trust Act, and over there, wave over here. The brains of my outfit is over there. Chris Barkley put together something called the Trust Act, which is a process which allows us to finally come to a balance in the cost and the revenue of entitlements. And so I'm the lead of that, along with Joe Manchin, senator from West Virginia. So got a Republican and a Democrat. We got Kyrsten Sinema, another Democrat. We got other Republicans. So we try and get a number of each in each party. And that's the good news. We get along pretty well.
Thank you. Thank you. I think it's important to.
And by the way, the other thing is I should note is that even though I can't figure out how to use technology, people like Chris do. He understands how to do it, and
it gets done.
And it gets done. Each senator. My guess is each senator has a staff of smart people that are maybe 25 to 30 people for each senator. And senators who are more senior. I'm a freshman senator. Senators that are more senior that have committee chairmanship positions or ranking member positions, they probably have another, 10 staff people. So I've got 25 or 30 people who are helping me, and they're smarter than I am and more focused on their issue area than I am, and help guide me.
Thank you. So it's difficult for some to get too deeply engaged in geopolitics and long-term issues and potential outcomes when they're worried about a recession. Give us your informed opinion. Where are we going? Are we heading into a recession? If so, is there anything we can do to soften that? What do you see coming?
Yeah, you probably have heard stories about Yogi Berra with his non sequiturs. One of his great lines was, "I don't like to forecast, particularly if the future's involved." And so I can't forecast what's going to happen to the economy. I made my living for 25 years in the private sector. Most of that time as an investor, buying businesses or starting businesses, trying to make them better. And when I'd buy a business, I'd put up maybe a third of the price in cash, in equity, but I'd borrow 2/3. So that meant I owed the bank 2/3, and I had to pay interest to the bank. And if a recession came along, why, how am I going to make enough money to pay the interest? And if I can't, the bank will take over my business. I'll lose all my investment. So we're always worried about recessions. But you know what we did? We said, we're not going to stop what we're doing. We're going to plow ahead, because recessions come and then they go. The good news about recessions is they're only around for a year or two, and then they're gone. And a good recession is an opportunity as an investor to make an investment or to buy a house or to go for a new job. It's an opportunity. You take advantage of it, and you make sure that you live your life in such a way that if there is a recession, it's not going to cause you to go bankrupt. You don't borrow so much money that if things turn around that you're going to be lost. So in my investment life, we didn't borrow too much money. We tried to manage it in such a way that even in the worst circumstances, we'd survive. And so I don't spend a lot of time worried about whether there's a recession coming. If there is, we'll be fine. The rest of the world will have a recession as well. We'll all come out of it, and life will go on.
Thank you. There's an interesting workforce trend that plays in many ways into some of the things we've been talking about. There's a reduction, particularly in the United States, and particularly among young men who are stepping out of the workforce. They're simply not engaging in the workforce. are you aware of any of the impact of that trend? And how does that strike you as someone who has created so many jobs? What do you think is happening in the psychology of the young worker who chooses not to engage? Is it fear? Is it lack of confidence? Are people looking at the United States as a failed experiment? Why would that be happening?
One, because people make silly mistakes. Why do I say that? We get confused as to what it is that'll make us happy, and we listen to other people who tell us what'll make us happy. And the reality is, if you don't have a job, if you don't have some occupation, and by the way, maybe your job is working in a charitable organization, you're not being paid. If you're a multimillionaire, you don't need a job. But if you don't have a job to do, if you don't have something to occupy yourself, if you don't have a passion, a purpose in life, you're not going to be happy. If you're just sitting on the beach, it's really boring sitting on the beach after about a week. I mean, I know when I lost my presidential bid, it's like I had nothing to do. I went to the beach, and it's like, this is really boring. I mean, running for president, that's engaging and exciting. If you get the chance to do it for sure. And, but you'll only be happy if you're really engaged in something and working hard and straining your brain or your muscles and interacting with other people. That's number one. I mean, there's something, I didn't know about this. I'm not a great student of economics and so forth. I only took Economics 101 in college, so that's my excuse. But I didn't realize there's a term called social capital. And they rank all the states for their degree of social capital. I had to ask Chris, what's social capital the other day? Because it said Utah's number one in the country in social capital. And social capital says, are people getting married? Are they having kids? Are they going to school? Are they committing suicide? That's obviously a negative. Are they engaged in the workforce? Are they productive? I mean, output per person. I mean, so they measure all these elements and decide which states are the most high in social capital. We're number one. And yet, as a country, I think it's fair to say we're sort of trending downward. There are more suicides. There are more deaths by overdoses. There are people dropping out. Lying flat is a concern in China they're talking about, the same withdrawal from their economy. And the reality is that'll mean people are not as happy. I mean, the funny thing is, getting married, having kids, having a job, and having a purpose bigger than your own selfish interests makes you happier. It's just there's a guy named David Brooks. He's a columnist for the New York Times. Yeah, he wrote a book called The Second Mountain. But he also said that as he's gone back and looked at what makes people happy, he wrote a whole book about this, it is people who make commitments to someone or to something. They make a commitment and then they honor it. It's like having things that you're committed to and honoring it. And whether I agree with what you commit to or not isn't the important thing. The important thing for your happiness is the things you believe in, and you commit yourself to them. And doing so will make you happier. And by the way, our society greater.
I agree with you. So, I like to end on a positive note in these annual conversations we have. So I'd like to ask you about what causes you to be optimistic, but I'd like to add a little more depth to it. I think it's a unique opportunity to hear from a United States Senator on this topic. I don't fault young people when they look at our form of government and begin to question it, because it's a little messy right now. It's actually designed to be messy, but it feels even more messy right now. And you hear calls for a different form of government. Perhaps in another country, they're doing it better. They're happier than we are. They're taking care of each other better than we are. If I could, what makes you optimistic about our country? And could I ask you to make the case for the American way of life?
Yeah, very, very simply, which is that we have extraordinary challenges. We face a juggernaut in the China approach. Authoritarian governments have a huge advantage. They can move quickly, don't need to get people's opinions. If there's an opinion they don't want to hear from, they can kill you or put you in jail for life. That's what's happening in Russia. That's what's happening in China. So it's very fast moving. It has some huge advantages. It also has some huge disadvantages, which is people who are afraid to take risks are therefore less likely to be innovative and creating the enterprises and the opportunities of the future. And freedom is an extraordinarily powerful elixir. Those nations that have freedom just outcompete those that don't. And while we have our challenges, and while Washington has too much noisemakers and too few lawmakers, we do have freedom. And we have in the past been able to take advantage of that extraordinary elixir for our betterment and the betterment of the world. I mean, we had free enterprise when the rest of the world said, no, it's much smarter to have the government tell everybody what to make and how much to make. That sure sounded good, didn't it? To tell everybody what to do? It just didn't work. Freedom, with all its messiness, with all of its unproductive decision-making, freedom works better. And in my opinion, freedom will continue to outperform. Will we have points of retrenchment and weakness? No question about it. But in the final analysis, I believe a free people will, one, insist on freedom ultimately, and will outperform anything else in the world.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thanks, guys.
Senator Romney.
Do we get to ask them any questions? Or?
Yeah, do we have,
You guys have to go to class, or, I mean...
do we have time or audio for questions? Could we have a few?
I'll repeat the question, so you don't have to wait for the mic. Go ahead, shoot.
Sorry, so my name is Rayshon Baker. My roommate's name is James Van Looy. He had a few questions.
You get one.
So one of them is, what role, if any, should the federal government play in AI regulation?
What role should the government play in AI regulation? As much as we think we can play to provide safeguards against the technology from hurting us, and we're all struggling, as I've mentioned, to figure out just what that might be. And there are some things, for instance, we can say, okay, one of the big risks is disinformation, all right? Deep fakes going out, particularly before the 24 election, of candidates saying things that they obviously didn't say. And so we're looking to say, hey, look, if you put up a deep fake, it's got to be labeled as being AI generated. Got to put that on there. Well, we can say that, but by the way, China doesn't respond to our regulations, and Russia doesn't respond to our regulations. So we can do that for American companies, and hopefully they'll have some impact. But so we can regulate it somewhat. But again, it's on the internet. It's open sourced, so it's for everybody. We have a hard time regulating the world, hard enough regulating ourselves. So I mean, that's what we're going to have to do is, I think, application by application decide. When I say an application, for instance, deep fakes, or how about military? Our military is really working on what things they can do to make sure that any weapons in the future can only be fired against a human with a human intervention, as opposed to, so no machine can make a decision to kill a human being, all right? And we want to have that agreement reached with other countries in the world. So that requires sitting down and negotiating that with every country in the world, which is you can build these things to do whatever you want with your drones and whatever, but the final kill decision has to be made by a human being. And that's probably something we have to do on a global basis. So others we can do domestically. One is, how do we protect our banks? I mean, what's going to keep AI from going into your bank account and taking all your money? And that's going to require an investment in this country, billions of dollars to develop AI systems to protect against AI. And can we stay ahead? I don't know if we can stay ahead, but so it's application by application strategy.
Thank you, sir.
Yes, sir.
How would the U.S. move away from the political dialogue, as you said, with individuals who make more noise on Capitol Hill instead of doing more work, maybe?
Yeah. How do we get from the ugliness? How do we get away from the ugliness in this country? I don't know the answer to that. We have become less kind, less listening, less prone to hear people across the aisle express their point of view, less willing to empathize with others that are different. We don't get the same news. We don't get the same facts. Some people watch one cable source or online source, others look at another. We don't even have the same facts. How are we going to make this work? I don't know the answer. I can tell you that in the history of our country and in the history of other nations in peril, one of two things has brought people to their senses. One is either a crisis so severe it woke people up, but not so severe that it killed the country. or number two, an extraordinary leader, a person of such magnitude, personal honor and integrity, that he or she was able to bring the world together and their world together. Golda Meir in Israel, in our country, Abraham Lincoln. I mean, after the Civil War, to say in his inaugural address, with malice toward none and charity for all. It's like, are you kidding? They just killed my niece, my brother, whatever, with malice toward none and charity toward all. I mean, the extraordinary leader. Winston Churchill. That's, in my opinion, where we have to go. And do I see that on the horizon today? No. All right. I don't see someone who is so powerful and so beloved that the nation comes to that person and they're able to have that influence. That'd be nice. Yes, sir.
You mentioned semiconductors a lot.
Yeah.
You mentioned semiconductors a lot, and it's become a really important issue. And I know that President Biden just passed the CHIPS Act, where he's trying to bring fabs over back to American soil as opposed to overseas in Taiwan and Singapore and all these other countries. What's your opinion on that the administration and America's in general ability to bring semiconductor manufacturing back to American soil, even though considering it's a lot cheaper over there?
Yeah. I think it's the right decision. I voted for the CHIPS Act. It was one of those instrumental in making sure it passed. I can't tell you with 100% confidence it'll be successful. I know that it'll take at least $100 billion to invest in making chips here, and even then we may not be competitive. China has invested at least that much, and they can't make them yet. Taiwan leads the world. We at least are going to have TSMC, the Taiwanese company, managing and building the facilities here. So we got a good shot that we'll be able to learn from them, and we'll be able to produce here. And people say, well, this is industrial policy. It's like, yeah, but it's also national security policy. You need chips, all right, for airplanes, for fighters, for weapons. And we can't rely on a place 100 miles from China to make all of our chips. So we're going to try and make chips here, and hopefully we'll be successful, but it'll take us 6, 8, 10 years. And until then, we sure hope that TSMC is able to do fine in Taiwan. Yeah, thank you. Yes, way back there. I'm trying to get students by and large, so I apologize for the older folks I'm not calling on.
So recently, Utah voted for the Better Boundaries Initiative in order to kind of curb gerrymandering in the state. Our state legislature kind of overruled that in our current congressional map, where they kind of split the Salt Lake Valley between 4 different congressional districts far away. I was wondering what your opinion was on that.
Yeah, one, I make it a habit not to criticize our state legislature, all right? Because I'm at the federal level. I don't want them returning fire. Number 2, I haven't found a good way to avoid gerrymandering. The division of congressional districts is a political process. And the Democrats gerrymander and the Republicans gerrymander. I don't know what the right division of Utah would be for congressional districts. I used to say, well, it should be done by geography, all right? So we should have, Salt Lake City just be one district, and then northern Utah be another district, and southern Utah another district. And then it was pointed out to me, yeah, but we want to have each of our Congress people have a slice of rural Utah, so we have more rural Utah influence in Washington on the various committees. It's like, oh, hadn't thought about that. And that makes some sense. At the same time, they say we'd like to have each of our Congress people have a slice of if you will, urban Salt Lake, so they understand the problems of the cities and care about those things. It's like, oh, yeah, that makes sense too. So I have not found a good answer to it. I think one thing is clear that the court has pointed out, the Supreme Court, which is if the districts have been divided in such a way that they discriminate based on race, and there may be other dimensions they could discriminate as well, but that's not going to stand. The court's going to say, no, you can't do that. But saying we're going to divide them, Republican, Democrat, rural, urban, how you get around that, I just don't know. Yeah, sorry.
Let's
Yes,
do
sir.
one more.
Oh, one more. Okay, I got one here. Yes, sir. Oh, I haven't called any women. Okay, I'll call. Sorry, I apologize. Yes, ma'am.
My name is Emma Ergang, and I'm not a Utah voter, but I am curious still of what role, if any, do you feel that your religious beliefs have made in talking about like the social capitals that you were mentioning about like how those certain practices lead to social capital? Do you think that there's any connection in Utah to the religion?
Yeah, first of all, I'd sure like you to become a voter in Utah, if you will, please.
I'm not living here long term. I'm out.
I do believe that one of the elements of social capital has been our association with groupings that are not just based on work or politics. So whether it's religion or unions or Boy Scouts, Girl Scouts, charitable organizations, and we're just doing less and less of that. As you've probably seen in the polls from Pew Research, the number of people who go to a church, any church, has continued to go down. And I think that relates to the reduction in social capital globally. Just because if you go to church and your church has boundaries that include different communities, different ethnicities, different socioeconomic groups, you exchange communication with people who are different than yourself. And you begin to understand other people and their concerns. It gives you more empathy. So a reduction in religious attendance, I think, probably correlates with a reduction in social capital. I just think that, virtually every religion I can think of encourages people to be more kind, more forgiving, more empathetic, more peace-loving. Those are certainly part of my character by virtue of my faith, and I think true of other people in their faiths. I lived, as you probably know, for 40 years in Massachusetts. The state there was over 50% Catholic, and the Catholic Church had an enormous impact, I think, on the social capital of the state. Massachusetts ranks #1 in education by far in the country. The NAEP exams that look at K through 12, Massachusetts is off the charts. And I think a lot of that has to do with Catholic schools. The Catholic Church put in place Catholic schools. And so for the for the public schools to compete with the Catholic schools, they had to up their game. And as a result, we just had better education. And there are other things as well that were done legislatively. But I think churches generally have a real impact on social capital. That doesn't mean that people who are not part of churches don't have good values. They do. But for those of us that need a little kick in the pants, I think it may help from time to time. Look, I know we face some real challenges, and I know the future is far more cloudy than the past, of course, by definition. The past has been written. I would give anything to be in your position. I would love to be young again. I would love to have my life ahead of me. I'd love to wonder who I'm going to marry and what kids I'm going to have. I mean, all these things are exciting and fun. Life is fantastic. Living is just, it's wonderful. I mean, every day I look outside and think, isn't this great to be alive and to enjoy all this, despite all the challenges we face? And living here, living in the best country in the world, in my opinion, living in the best state in the country with the best social capital. I mean, look at the mountains. I lived in Massachusetts. Massachusetts is a beautiful state, but there are no mountains like that. I mean, this is a fantastic place to live. We, after Ann and I moved out west, we'd been about 30 days away from Massachusetts. She said, remind me again why we lived in Massachusetts for the last 40 years. All right, look at the beauty here. It's wonderful. So enjoy your life, and even though there will be there'll be heartaches and sorrow in your life and disappointment and reversals, it's all thrilling and exciting. And you are fighting for a great cause, which is the preservation of this great nation. Thanks, guys. Good to be with you. Thank you.
And then what exactly did you guys do? Because I know it's a little bit.
Everyone, in just a few minutes, we'll have the policy panel portion of our event. So after you're done chatting, if you could all take your seats again to enjoy a policy panel for the second portion of the event. Thank you.
We're going to keep doing the panel discussion. There's a second one. So welcome to stick around.
I never knew rich people. I got a plane down here, commercial plane,
For those of you sticking around, we invite you to please come and take a seat. We'll have a panel discussion. Get started here in just a sec. I'm here for you.
Please grab your seat. We're going to get started.
We want to thank Senator Romney and Rick Larsen for that excellent discussion. Now we have the privilege of talking with a couple of experts in the realm of economic policy. It's my pleasure to moderate our policy panel portion of the Sutherland Congressional Series today. My name is Nick Dunn, and I serve as Vice President of Strategy and Communications for Sutherland Institute. And our panelists today, I'll start here on the end with Beth Akers. Beth is a Senior Fellow for the American Enterprise Institute. She is also a feature contributor to Sutherland Institute's podcast, Defending Ideas, where she talks about defending enterprise. Also, we are joined by Peter Phillips. He is a professor of economics here at the University of Utah and also a former chair of the economics department here at the university. Beth and Peter, thank you so much for joining us.
Glad to be here. Thank you.
Is this working?
It is.
Am I working?
We'll see over the next 45 minutes, right?
We have both committed to be as charming as Senator Romney, though it seems not as many folks will be here to take pleasure in that. But
That's okay. We'll send the video far and wide. And
Next time I want to follow Ted Cruz. I think it might be an easier lift.
Well, I think that was a great discussion to kind of tee things up with both of you, because we want to give the folks in our audience and the folks watching online kind of some understanding of economic policy. How are things looking today? Any prognostication for the future? And I want to start out by making a pop culture reference, which maybe doesn't happen as often for folks in the world of economics. But recently there was a country song by a man named Oliver Anthony called Rich Men North of Richmond. Essentially, it's kind of a working class lament about it's hard to get ahead in this economy. You work hard and you don't get paid enough, and things are just tough economically. It has started a national conversation around that question of the health of our economy across the nation and whether we truly are an upwardly mobile society. So in the context of these debates that have been going on as far as the economic health of the United States, I want to ask both of you for the opening question. On a scale of 1 to 10, how would you rate the economic health of the United States and of Utah? 1 being, it's the worst economy we've ever had. There's no such thing as upward mobility. Everyone is just stuck. Your hard work doesn't matter. And then 10 being, it's the greatest economy in any of our lifetimes or in history. You know, anyone who is not rising up swiftly, they only can blame themselves. So somewhere on that 1 to 10 spectrum, Peter, let's start with you and then go to Beth. National economy, Utah economy, 1 to 10. What's your take?
In the summertime, I'm a backcountry ranger in the Grand Teton National Park. And this summer, I went into the Target that had just been built in Jackson. And I was talking to the cashier as I bought my product. And she said she lived in Idaho Falls, and she commuted to work at Target every day, about an hour and a half each way. And the reason was she could make $15 an hour in Idaho Falls at the Target there and make $25 an hour in Jackson at the Target. The reason she could make more in Jackson is because people making $15 or even $25 an hour can't live in Jackson. They have to live over the hill. And as prices rise in the communities on the other side of the mountain, they have to live farther and farther away. And so Idaho Falls is a place where she had to live to find a job to make $25 an hour. If she worked full-time for a year, that would translate into $50,000 a year. And if you subtracted just the wear and tear on her car and the cost of transportation, that $50,000 goes down. And if you take the 3 hours a day that she travels, that $50,000 goes down more. And she's not at the bottom of the heap at all. But the people that live in Jackson are at the top of the heap. The entry-level home in Jackson costs $2.5 million a year. I never knew rich people before I became a backcountry ranger in the Grand Tetons. Now I know a grunt load of people that do things like, well, the one I'm thinking about, he owns an airplane, and his wife owns an airplane. And he is selling his house to downsize because it was a 60,000 square foot house with a 20,000 square foot cabin in the back. And so he's selling that for $27 million, and he's going to go down into something smaller. I even heard him use the word condo. And that is, in terms of the personal reality, where we are. I live near Liberty Park, and I just bought a smartwatch, which is a dictator and insists that I walk 10,000 steps a day. And so I go around Liberty Park. And every morning, because you get up earlier, you're going to sweat yourself to death. Every morning, as I walk around Liberty Park, I see the homeless folks that spent the night there being cleared out for the day to make room for me so I can obey my smartwatch. Okay, on a scale of 1 to 10, I give our economy a 5. A 5 getting credit for we're kind of making it, and a 5 for subtracting credit for we're not sort of making it together, we're making it apart. And I would like to see more making it that had some more togetherness of it. And that's really what I take from Senator Romney when he talks about social capital. I didn't hear Senator Romney when he went into social capital. I heard Mission President Romney. And for me, that's a plus. I'm not a member of the church, but I fully join the Hosanna chorus that Utah benefits from the Mormon church and the social capital it provides by keeping people together as opposed to people keeping them apart. So 1 to 10, I pick a 5 because that measures we're getting it, but we're getting it apart instead of together.
Thank you, Peter. Beth.
Great, yeah, so, great points. I'll do a bit more of, I think, an economic snapshot of where we are today. So, if you're a viewer of cable news, we are always in deep crisis and everyone's hair is always on fire. The reality about our economic situation today is, in fact, for people who are looking for work, they're in pretty good situation. There's plenty of stories of individuals commuting for jobs and things like that that are, not earning them a living wage and things. But on average, people who are looking for work are finding it. We have a historically low rate of unemployment, 3.5%. reflecting a tremendous recovery from the COVID pandemic and what could have been a really catastrophic economic situation. So we're in good circumstances there. We're continuing to see that prices are rising in the economy, which has negative effects on families and individuals who are trying to pay the bills, but we're seeing that that is slowing, and so it's trending in the right direction. So generally speaking, the snapshot of America's economy today is good for American workers. I'm going to give us a 6, and then I'm going to give Utah an 8, even better. So the thing I didn't talk about yet was opportunity in America, which is, of course, I think really central to thinking about the health of our economy. Research shows, in fact, that there is opportunity for people to raise themselves out of the circumstances in which they're born into. And in fact, referencing what Senator Romney raised earlier, some of the research was that we know that Utah actually excels in this dimension, and that the opportunity that people have to raise their financial circumstances from where they're born to where they land as an adult is actually tremendous. And Utah stands out first in that category, and social capital being one of the potential drivers that allows that to be the case. So I'm going to give a 6 to us at a national level and an 8 to us locally here in Utah.
And I want to take off on what Beth just said. The last 3 years were incredible in terms of the American economy and our experience of it. In 2020 and 2021, we almost got hit by a bus collectively. Unemployment rose to a height only approximated the Great Depression, 20% unemployment. 15% unemployment, 50% higher than the highest unemployment of the Great Recession or the Big Recession of 1980-81. But that unemployment went away in a blink of the eye. And not only did it go away, it went way far away. So Beth is spot on that today we have an unemployment level that matches the best years of the 1950s. So that's an amazing outcome. The bus missed us, and we're not roadkill. But
or we were roadkill, and then we rose back up. Something like that, I think.
Right after that huge spike in unemployment, there became a huge spike in inflation. So inflation spiked to double what it was at any point in time since World War II. But then it appears to be going away in almost the same blink of an eye. And economists like to arm wrestle over details, and so we're only sort of 2/3 of the way gone, and it may stay here, and that's bad news, or it may disappear just like the unemployment did, which was good news. Mm-hmm. So it's an open question as to whether or not that huge disruption in the American economy is not going to have a lasting echo. But at the moment, it looks like maybe it's not.
You both touched on a couple things that I want to see if we can intertwine together, and I'm glad you mentioned inflation. I want to get to that a little bit later, especially when we talk about the context of family affordability for young people who are forming families right now or looking to form families, starting their careers, how sort of the feeling of the burden of increasing costs might affect them. So I want to get more into that, but to kind of lay the groundwork for that, when we talk about the strength of an economy, and I think it kind of came through in both of your answers, that embedded in that definition is upward mobility and opportunity. And so if an economy is doing great for a lot of people, but it feels like some folks are getting left behind, we all want to focus on that. We all care about that. So from the standpoint of upward mobility, and Beth, you mentioned Utah being an 8. I wonder if you both can talk a little bit more about what are the factors, and for folks here who say, well, I want to support economic policy that's going to mean upward mobility for as many people as possible. It's going to mean as many families as possible can afford to provide for their families. Thinking in those terms, how should we be understanding and defining what it means to have a strong economy, and how much does sort of the upward mobility of the folks on the lower rungs of the economic ladder factor into that definition? And what are some of the factors? If you had to pick just 2 or 3, these are the most important things that we wish all of our policymakers and our business leaders would really focus on when it came to creating an economy that was genuinely an upwardly mobile society. What are those core factors that define a strong economy with lots of opportunity? Beth, let's start with you.
Sure. So I'd have to say that I think the framework I want to imagine is that we're creating opportunity. We're not creating the mobility. We're not forcing individuals, into different segments of the economy. What we're doing is creating mechanisms that allow for people to create a life and well-being for themselves. I think education is sort of the most obvious manner in doing that. We've seen historically primary and post-secondary education serving as a tremendous vehicle for social mobility. So I think we need to continue to maintain our investments in those, also maintain competitiveness in those sectors in order to sustain their excellence. But again, I think our emphasis should be on maintaining opportunity at the lower levels of the income distribution. The emphasis should be on ensuring that we don't have a system of economy where the economic circumstances that you're born into are the sentence that you have for the rest of your life. Research has shown in a number of different places that in fact we have a pretty high level of social mobility in this country. Could we do better? Certainly. Could we invest more in other mechanisms that do a better job of providing alternative pathways to mobility through career training, apprenticeship programs, things like that? Absolutely. But I think that's where the emphasis should be.
Peter, how do you define that? How do you define an upwardly mobile economy, and what are the factors that we should focus on to create that?
When I was in high school, I told my dad that I was going to be a really good student, and I was going to go to Pomona College, which was one of the most exclusive liberal arts colleges around, and then I was going to go to either Stanford or Berkeley, and then I was going to go out there and be a great economist. And my father turned to me in very stern voice. He said, "Son, it's better to be lucky than to be good." And it turned out the smartest thing I did was to be born in 1947. It was a good choice on my part, because that meant that when I graduated and went out the labor market, there were lots of jobs. I got 23 job interviews and seven job offers when I came out with my PhD. Had I come out just a little bit later, because I came out in 1978, if I'd come out in 1980 or 1981, I would have been screwed, because I forgot what my dad told me. Be lucky, son. Be sure to be lucky. Senator Romney said, recessions come and go. Don't worry about them. They're around for a year or two, and then they're gone. Well, I think that was reflecting his experience as a young man, which was my experience as a young man, because the downturns in the 1950s were common, but they were short-lived. They became a little fewer and farther between, starting in the 1960s. Through the 1970s and 1980s, they became a little more spread apart. Starting about 1990, they got further apart. They began to be about 8 years apart or something like that. But the mother of all great downturns in 2007-8 lasted for 6 years before we got back to go. And what happened to the folks that came out into the labor market in the period 2008 through 2015 is they just didn't have the same start that other people had. Rodney Dangerfield said, "I went to the track, and when the gun went off, they shot my horse." And if you are going into the labor market and you're going in during a big downturn like that, they're shooting you. And so one really good policy that the government can have to help with upward mobility is to help more people be lucky by having fewer time periods where the labor market is totally dead. And that's one of the great things that has happened recently, and it's just astounded me, and I think much of the economics profession, is that federal policy took what could easily have been the second Great Recession within a decade and blew it away. So the recession got shot instead of us.
So let's dive into that for a second to kind of bring it to the present day. And you're specifically talking about the impact of the pandemic and how essentially virtually overnight putting a stop to huge sections of the economy in terms of economic activity with people staying home or not going to work, or in some cases working remotely, but so many things kind of ground to a halt. Your contention is essentially, look, because of the federal response, we averted what could have otherwise been even a deeper and a much more prolonged recession. So I want to see if we can talk about some of the pros and cons with that, because if you're saying, look, that helped to soften what otherwise would have been really, really rough for the country. You mentioned earlier as well the issue of inflation and how costs of regular consumers, folks are feeling it in their grocery bill, in their gas bill, in their housing costs, of course. So I wonder if between the two of you, let's talk through, just from your best angle objectively, what are some of the pros and cons from the federal response to what could have been a really severe post-pandemic recession? And then maybe give a sense of, well, where are we now? What should we do moving forward with respect to that specific recovery?
I think Professor Phillips and I agree that this was actually a resounding success and that we avoided what could have been catastrophic. I think where there is a difference, whether the difference is between he and I or not, I'm not sure, is about whether or not the effort and the fiscal spending that occurred to prevent that overshot the mark and could have been restrained in a way that would have allowed us to avoid some of the pain that we are now experiencing in the form of the high interest rates and inflation. And so, there's criticism all the time of the specific spending that took place. For instance, the Paycheck Protection Program allowed a lot of businesses to stay in operation, which was part of the mechanism for supporting the economy to come back online quickly so that we didn't experience that second Great Recession. But then we see critiques all the time about how a lot of that money went to rich businesses or rich individuals who are business owners. And so there's a tension there, is that did we go too far in spending resources that pushed us into the place we are today, which is with rampant inflation, which seems to be getting into control. And I do tend to think that we're on the path towards the soft landing that we were all hoping for, but seemed like a pie in the sky dream maybe a year ago. So I think that's where the tension is, if there's any, in our retrospective analysis of what happened.
Peter, overall a good response, but did we go too far? If you've ever watched a prize fight and you see some fighter that's on the rope and the other fighter is about to deliver a knockout punch, and the one on the rope ducks to avoid that knockout punch but gets caught with a left hook, and you say, "Are you sorry you missed that knockout punch because you got a left hook?" And the fighter says, "Under the circumstances, I'll take the left hook." And in this case, the inflation that we've experienced is that left hook. And I don't know where you got this, gal, because I'm supposed to disagree with the Sutherland folks. But I don't think, if we dug down into the details, we could probably disagree. I'm going to probably talk about...
I'm confident of that, yeah. We just may not get there today.
I'm going to probably talk about supply chains a little bit more and sort of the structural as opposed to a monetary explanation of some of that inflation. But we're not going to disagree. A, the inflation was there, and boy, was it there. And B, the inflation's coming down. Boy, is it coming down. And C, it's not down. And at the moment, it's at 6%, which is pretty close to unacceptable. Mm-hmm. And so those are the facts. And one nice thing about economists is that they can agree on many of the facts, but it's not nearly as fun in terms of calling names. But I take it. The economy is on the ropes. They missed the knockout punch. They got the left hook. And now we're going to see whether they can bounce back into the middle of the ring and get through the rest of the round.
And I think part of what's still in debate, even though we agree on that sort of fact, is really what are the consequences of maintaining fiscal deficits, for example. It seems like before we got to COVID and the fiscal intervention that prevented that and maybe led us to where we are today, there was a disagreement between maybe not economists, but between political types about what are the consequences of maintaining deficits and spending beyond our means. And I think, my perspective of what happened with the COVID and the inflation that we saw as a result of the massive fiscal intervention is that put a bit of a check on the theory that we could continue to spend without restraint, but would not face any consequences. And maybe you feel differently about that one.
now we're into the mud wrestling.
I'm just trying to make it exciting.
And I'm not sure we want to go down that road. I just will quickly highlight for the listeners that Beth's perspective sees the federal budget like a family budget. And in my view, there's a fundamental error in that analogy. And the error is the family does not print its own money, and the federal government does. Now, Beth is likely to say, well, that's a bad thing, but then would have to get into the conversation about whether that's a bad thing or a good thing. But the family budget model for the federal budget is an imperfect analogy.
So with that, though, let's mud wrestle for a little bit, just to give something interesting to the folks out there. But so how should we be thinking about government spending at the federal level? So when large proposals come forth, there are often voices saying, well, some of this I might support, but it's way too expensive. We need to cut back the spending. Some of Senator Romney's proposals in his time in the US Senate have included mechanisms to make it essentially cost neutral, saying, well, I want to propose this. A good example is the Family Security Act, where he was looking at other ways that they could trim some spending or consolidate funding streams elsewhere to strive towards things like that being budget neutral. So maybe I'll phrase it in that way, that when we are thinking about big or impactful policy ideas at the federal level going through Congress, is it a good thing to strive for those to be budget neutral, or does that not actually matter that much in the long run? Peter, I'll go with you first, then Beth to the rebuttal.
I want you to stand right down there, and I want you to lift one foot off the ground. And then pick the other foot off the ground. Are you a foot off the ground?
I think that probably wouldn't work.
No, that's not going to work for you. Okay. And if you use the family budget or a business budget as a model for the federal budget, you're going to miss a key point. In contrast to you as an individual or one of the businesses that Senator Romney bought and ran, the federal government can literally pick one foot off the ground and the other foot off the ground and be a foot off the ground under several circumstances. Not all circumstances, but several circumstances. There is a circumstance in when that's not possible, and that's where that all of the productive resources are otherwise engaged. So that if the federal government picks one foot off the ground and then picks the other foot off the ground, the federal government has to pull away from one of these other uses, whether state uses or private uses, putting that one of those 2 feet back on the ground. But as long as there are unused resources, you can pull off a magic trick and be a foot off the ground. You can't do it, a business can't do it, but the federal government can do it under certain circumstances. And during the pandemic recession, during the Great Recession, during the Great Depression, those were circumstances where the government could pull off this magic levitation, because you pull the one foot off the ground, you pick the other foot up, and you're pulling not resources that Beth is using, but you're pulling resources that were not being used into being used. And so that's why using the budget analogy to understand the federal budget has strong exceptions.
Beth, magical levitation, is that wise economic fiscal policy?
Yeah,
I just like the analogy.
Say
so.
that? I guess I did.
My PhD is not in magic, it's instead in economics, so I'll offer a counter view. My sense is I don't think that's wrong. I mean, I think there are instances at an individual or a family and at a federal level where it is appropriate to spend beyond your means. For instance, I encourage people to borrow to pay for college. It's a great investment. There are times when borrowing, issuing debt can yield great things for the country. In this instance of spending of evading the COVID recession, I mean, the returns on that spending, at least the first 50, 75% of it, were probably quite huge. My concern is that when we've gone beyond to the point where we are today, that there are in fact consequences, and the trade-offs that we're signing up for may not in fact be worth what we're getting for it. When I say consequences, I do believe that some of the inflation that we've experienced are because of our fiscal policy that we have employed. We've also seen that U.S. debt has been downgraded. The interest on outstanding U.S. debt is now a massive portion of our federal budget. Eventually, at this pace, will become the largest line item in the federal budget. And so I think that, I don't think that's wrong, but I do think that we're farther into that situation to the point where the trade-offs are not necessarily in our favor. And I think we should be concerned more than we are today about maintaining budget neutrality on new proposals.
There she goes again, using the family budget as analogy for the federal government. If you're going to use a family budget borrowing as analogy for the federal government, you have to mention my daughter. Because when she borrows from me, she knows one key fact. She's never going to have to pay it back. The federal government, when it borrows, do you know who it borrows from? The federal government. It makes the money and then spends the money. And okay, let's see. Let's say that the federal budget, the federal debt is 10 times the federal budget. What could we do? Borrow some more. And that really wouldn't work if you're a family or a business. And it's not going to really happen in terms of the federal government, but I use that extreme example to drive home the point. Don't use the analogy of personal or business budgets to think about the federal budget, because there's one big difference. The federal borrows in US dollars that the federal government makes itself.
Beth, we're almost at time, but any quick reply to that? I could see this turning into a great, maybe come on our podcast, we'll do a future event, but this is a good discussion.
This is a debate over Keynesianism, folks.
Yes, this is a debate that goes much deeper than the two of us and has been raging in our profession for longer than I have been a part of it. So I don't think we'll succeed in resolving it today. But I do think, again, I'll emphasize, the creation of dollars has consequences in terms of inflation, which I believe, are potentially more consequential than the things we're giving up in terms of the spending. And so that is going to be a personal value judgment that we probably won't be able to agree on today.
Never bet against a team that has barrels of green ink.
So we'll have to leave that issue, though it's a very fascinating one. As we start to wrap up, and we'll have some time for questions, so any of you folks here, questions for our two panelists, we'll have a few minutes for that. So be thinking of what you want to ask, and I think we'll have a microphone. Nick back there has a mic he can pass around to get those questions from you so the folks on the live stream can hear it. Maybe to kind of to kick off our audience Q&A portion, I want to read a statistic from the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, kind of bringing things back a little bit to the really practical, the state of the workforce today, the ability of somebody who is looking for a work opportunity to be able to find that and use that as an engine of upward mobility to provide for themselves or their family. So the U.S. Chamber found that there are currently 9.8 million job openings in the U.S., but only 5.9 million unemployed workers. I want to get your quick reactions to that. What does that statistic tell you about the state of the workforce today? Is there just a mismatch? Are people just not willing to work? What is it that's creating such a big gap, and what should folks in the room and online understand about that number? Beth, let's go with you first, and then Peter.
On a slightly wonky note, I'll say I'm a little bit concerned about the way that we measure job openings today, and it may look like there are a lot more. But the other data that we have all indicates that we have a really tight labor market, and I think that means for the vast majority of people who have the physical resources to go and work, that means that opportunity exists. I think that our focus should not be on the question of whether that opportunity exists, but rather for people who have constraints on their ability to participate in the labor market, how do we support them? And so first acknowledging that opportunity exists, that it's actually quite robust in our economy, it is an important thing, and then turn to what else?
Peter, is there a serious labor force shortage that's affecting our economy that we should be concerned about?
Beth doesn't fight fair. She uses correct statistics. I was hoping that these Chamber of Commerce statistics would be out on the table to be chopped up, but she took them right off. There's a federal survey called Job Openings and Labor Turnover Survey, which is, if you're interested in sort of the tightness or looseness of the labor market and the availability of jobs, that's the go-to statistics to look at. Although just simply talking about an unemployment rate of 3% is going to tell you that the labor market is tight. Now, the 1,000-pound gorilla in the room was something mentioned by Senator Romney, and that is the declining labor force participation rate, particularly of men in their prime age, which is considered to be age 25 to 55. Historically, the labor force participation of men rose in the 1800s. Around World War I, it was up around 90%. During World War II, it was through the roof. But it had been steadily in the low to middle 90s until the 2000s. And since then, it has been going down. It's in the high 80s at the moment. There is work being done on that, some very good work. There's a literature called The Deaths of Despair, where particularly rural males are dying unexplainably through overdoses and suicides when they should be doing what Senator Romney said, really Mission President Romney said, which is you should have a passion and you should be following that passion, be committed to it, and if you're engaged, you're going to be living well. And we have statistics that suggest that for some people that is just not happening. And that is very discouraging and concerning, and we don't know enough about the answers. But I can tell you that I have a sense of one of the bottom part of that distribution. I walk around Liberty Park, as I mentioned, and I see lots of homeless folks that Liberty Park is their living room. And these homeless folks are in that prime age. They are not teenagers. Well, they're not geezers the way I define geezers as somebody older than me. They're failing themselves, and I like to think we're failing them. I know I have a sense of dismay and even guilt walking around the park and seeing that. And we need to turn our attention to that for every reason that Senator Romney, Mission President Romney, said.
So there are people in need out there. They are deserving of opportunities, and I like kind of ending this portion on that compassionate note, that we want our economy to be a place that creates and fosters opportunity for those folks. We have a few minutes for questions, so who in the audience has something on their mind? Let's start right here, and we'll have time for a few of you, so please go ahead.
Just kind of, it's on, yeah, it is.
I don't think it's turned on. Oh, okay. Yeah. Sing into it, just like karaoke.
Right. So I guess just piggybacking off of the discussions regarding industry deregulation and just regulation regarding things like AI, what do you think creates this aversion towards things like fiscal policy when it comes down to policies like broader student debt forgiveness, stimulus checks, things like that? Yet there's very little, if any, debate on things like monetary policy on the end of the Federal Reserve.
Anyone want to jump into that first? I heard college loans. You have a lot of expertise there, Beth.
Sure. So monetary policy is directed by the Federal Reserve Bank, which is politically independent from the administration and is separate from the democratic process. And so we believe that's how it should be, because as economists, we're sort of above the fray of politics, and we want the institution to operate in response to what is the mission of the institution of the Fed, which is to stabilize the economy and minimize unemployment. And whereas the other piece of it is driven by the political machine, which of course we know operates with lots of different incentives and through the political process. So I think that we see that politicians in their response to spending is trying to respond to the preferences of their constituents who are concerned about their tax rate, for example, and also at the same time concerned about their student loan balances. And so I think that they kind of just exist in two separate realms. Did you want to describe it differently than that?
I've never been above the fray. Possibly below the fray. My good father said the best strategy in life is to duck. So luck and duck were his two advices. Now, take my economic history course, and I'll explain to you that the Federal Reserve is a political entity. run by the banks. And it was designed to be run by the banks. And that was its North Star, keeping the banks healthy and operating. And there's some good reasons that I'd like my bank to stay healthy and operating, thank you very much, at least until I get my money out of it, you know, and that's everybody's thought. So we have a dog in the hunt to have the banks being healthy and operating. But after World War II, the federal government passed a law that said that the Federal Reserve has to not only think about banks operating, but think about the labor market operating. So it should have two North Stars, one that way north, which is to keep the banks healthy, and one that way north, which would make jobs plentiful. And these two North Stars were in two different norths. And the Federal Reserve has to navigate that. And because the vast majority of decision makers on the Federal Reserve are bankers, they drive like my wife does, kind of leaning a little this way and not quite down the middle of the road. And so that particular segment of government is going to be nervous about loan forgiveness because they're in the business of making loans work. And so you're not preaching to the choir when you tell the Federal Reserve that loans ought to be forgiven. And I take it you're not preaching to Beth either.
There's another hand over here.
Sorry, so I came in late, so this may be a little off topic, but I wanted to ask, what are some of the challenges of bringing jobs back to America, and what effect would it have on the American market, detriments and benefits?
Okay, I didn't fully understand the question. Could you ask it again, please?
Yes, so what are some of the challenges of bringing jobs back to America, and what effect would it have on the American market, the detriments and benefits?
Got it now, yeah. Beth, you want to try that one first?
Sure. You know, I think that part of the reason that jobs have left America is because things can happen outside of this country cheaper. Labor is cheaper outside of the United States. May also be cheaper in certain instances because of the regulatory environment. And so from my perspective, we need a compelling reason to try to bring something back, and national security is, of course, an often cited reason for doing that. There is some, efficiency loss from bringing something back into this country that can be done cheaper elsewhere. And in every instance, policymakers should be thinking about what is the trade-off between that potential efficiency loss, that is, it costs more to do things here, versus the other goal that we're trying to achieve, be it national security or anything else. And so I think in each instance, we have to think about the potential advantages of, pursuing these separate goals versus the economic cost that is shrinking the pie by doing things, by conducting business in a way that's less than optimal.
I'm going to rewrite your question. You shouldn't have said, how can we get jobs back to America? You should have said, how can we get good jobs back to America? Jobs are back. Unemployment rate of 3%, jobs are back. But as I told in my story of the folks that are commuting from Idaho Falls to Jackson to get that job, there are a lot of good jobs that go missing. And why is that true? I'm not as worried about China from a political and military standpoint as Senator Romney is. But I'm quite worried about what a labor economist friend of mine said about 15 years ago when we were talking about China. He said, what part of 1 billion new workers in the world labor market don't you understand? And globalization has connected the American labor market to a global labor market in a way that has held down wages. Real blue-collar wages peaked in 1970 and have been basically flat since, once you adjust for inflation. And that corresponds to a time period when imports as a percent of GDP rose from about 5% to about 20% of GDP. That rise being a steady rise from around 1970 to before the Great Recession. And let me give you a feeling for that. When I was in high school in 1965, somebody told me a joke, said, hey, I have a car that has 4 forward gears. And if you were in high school in 1965, 4 forward gears was bizarre. Everyone had 3 gears and they were shifted on the handle. And he was talking about 4 gears on the floor. He said, yeah, it had 4 gears, first, second, third, and banzai. Now that's not funny today. But that was funny because it was so strange in 1965, and he was talking about a Datsun and the beginning of importing Volkswagens, Renaults, and Datsuns to the United States. And that was the beginning of the end of Geneva Steel, of Kennecott Copper, of U.S. Steel, that's now called USX, and manufacturing employment was 1/3 of all employment in the 1950s, and it's 1/10 today. It was a total transformation of the American labor market. One of the parts of that was a significant downward part of the American labor market ended up having lousy jobs. So I want your question to say, how can we get rid of those lousy jobs and get good jobs back instead? Now, I'm going to let you think about the answer.
Well, we're a little bit over time, but was there any final, if someone has a burning question, they're like, I can't get out of here without asking, if it's very brief? If not, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, just for the recording.
Like I said, this is a topic I'm still researching myself, but you both ranked Utah. I believe you ranked Utah economy at 5 at the beginning of this meeting, and you said, I think you said 6?
I gave it an 8.
8, wow. So how would you put the housing market in Utah into that? What would be your opinions on that? Because I know there's a lot of debate surrounding that.
Great question. I think we could have another forum to talk entirely about what's happening with home prices in the entire Mountain West region in particular. So I think that in the relatively recent history, we have seen this dramatic increase in prices that is making it more difficult to have a family and potentially will have impacts on social mobility in the years to come as we look back on it. I think fortunately there are areas still in the metro area that offer affordable housing options, which is unique to this place. When you look at other cities that have really unaffordable housing, there tends to be unaffordable housing in the commuting regions as well. So I think that offers some advantages to this region, but it is a question about where that trajectory will go and the potential impacts that that will have on the nature of growth in this region.
You want a cheap housing market? Get a lousy economy. I have a former graduate student that has retired last year from a college in upstate New York. She sold her house for $125,000, moved back to Salt Lake where she grew up, bought herself a small condo for $400,000.
We want to thank everyone for the questions and for, of course, Hinckley Institute for helping us put this on. As we finish, I want to ask a 10-second response question for each of you. And it is trying to kind of give our audience a sense of, okay, what's next when it comes to economic policy. You find yourself in an elevator with the Utah governor and legislative leadership, and then the president and congressional leadership. These two groups ask you, what's the one thing we should do from a public policy perspective to strengthen our economy and create more upward mobility for Americans and for Utahns? You have 10 seconds before they get off the elevator. What do you say to them? Peter, let's go with you first, and then Beth will give you the last word.
Go talk to Beth. You're not going to listen to me.
That's right, I win. Okay. Given that, I think we need to invest in ensuring that safety nets for our lowest income residents are robust and easily accessible. Also, maintenance of our investment in the education system to ensure that people have the skills to participate in our labor market.
Well, oh, Peter.
She got more than 10 seconds.
I think she took some of your seconds on that last part. Let's have a round of applause for our panelists. Beth Akers, Peter Phillips, thank you both for joining us, and thank you to everyone here at the University of Utah and Hinckley Institute, and those watching online for this Sutherland Institute Congressional Series. Last thing we want to mention to you, there on the screen is a QR code. We'd like to encourage all of you to take the survey. Let us know how this event was. Did you find it interesting? What other things would you like to share about your experience today? That'll help us continuously improve events as we go. So thank you very much.
It was a pleasure.